While it was really no surprise this weekend when Pierre Poilievre won the leadership of the Conservative Party, the extent of that victory sure was. It wasn't even close, as Poilievre took 68% of the points on the first and only ballot. With us for some perspective on the weekend and what comes next, let's welcome Ginny Roth, Vice President, National Practice Lead for Government Relations at Crestview Strategy. She was Director of Communications on the Poilievre campaign. And Andrew Coyne is here. He's the columnist, of course, for the Globe and Mail, and it's nice to see you, too, after having seen you in Ottawa this past weekend for one of the least interesting leadership conventions I can ever recall. Okay, full bias on the table right away. Don't you miss delegated conventions? Come on, be honest.
I mean, I don't.
Theatrical standpoint.
Yes, agreed.
Better for TV.
Well, here's what it looked like. Sheldon, you want to bring these numbers up here? Here's what the stat board had to say. Poilievre, as we suggest, winning 68.15% of the votes on the first ballot, of the points, rather. Jean Charest, who was supposed to be the prime challenger, only 16%, well back. Leslyn Lewis, a little below 10%. Roman Baber, a little over 5% of the points. Scott Aitchison, a little over 1% of the points. Many people, Ginny, to you first, saw this leadership race as a kind of a fight for the soul of the Conservative Party of Canada. If it was, what does that result tell us?
That it wasn't. I think the Conservative Party, any political party, when it loses a leader, is on a bit of a quest to sort out what it wants to be, and the biggest question for everyone is how to win. And so it was certainly that was certainly the question: what do we want to be, and what do we need to win? And the answer was really clear. I think it's evident from the results that the vast majority of people who are steadfast members, who sort of keep their membership up all through the years and the decades, and the new members, the people who are exploring the party for the first time or who've left the party and come back, definitively the vast majority of them all feel the same way about what they want. And we can get into that, but I think the battle over the soul of the party was a bit overdone as a narrative, and it turns out not to have been much of a battle.
Andrew, what do you say?
It was a very clear result in the sense that Poilievre won smashingly. It's not so clear what that means, other than that they want to be the party of Pierre Poilievre. They want to be a party that is unashamedly pugnacious, that is not apologizing for itself, that feels good about itself. And that is certainly one of Poilievre's strengths, is he doesn't back down. And that's a strength in politics generally, is if you feel like you look like you're confident in yourself. The question is, what's the actual content there? Conservatism in Canada has become, over the last 10 or 15 years, sort of performative. It's not a lot of substance to it. This was a lot of Conservatives' complaints at the end of the Harper era was, yeah, we were in power. What did we actually accomplish? How did we actually move Canada in a more conservative direction? Harper had a reputation for being very conservative, not because of what he did, but because he was pugnacious and he fought Liberals and he made Liberals angry. Poilievre is very much in that vein, but he didn't actually run on a really much of a substantive policy platform in that direction.
I don't know if either of you read Tasha Keridan's book, The Right Path, in which she suggests that the Poilievre approach to politics is actually not the way to win a general election. Might win you a leadership convention, it won't win you a general election. And she sort of divides conservatives into convoy conservatives, of which Poilievre is clearly the champion, and what she calls club conservatives, who are more the moderate, pragmatic red Tories who hang out at the Albany Club and have this kind of establishment tinge to them. If you're a club, clearly the convoy conservatives are in ascension here. If you're a club conservative, is there still a place for you in this party?
I don't think there are a lot of club conservatives left. And that's okay, they're getting older, and private members' clubs are not as popular as they once were. The types of people who came out to all events, I think, in the leadership race, not just Pierre Poilievre's, Roman Baber's as well, and Leslyn Lewis's. They were all different kinds of Canadians all across the country. And in many cases, for Poilievre's events, they came out in the thousands. Many of them erring on the younger side, as a sort of average age of the types of people who might want to make time in their day to go to a political event. And I'm willing to bet that none of them are members of private members clubs. And I don't think that's the worst thing, because I don't think most Canadians are members of private members clubs.
Well, that's a little narrow.
And I see what you mean on ideology,
that.
sure. Yeah. But I think that's also true. I think there are not a lot of people left who describe themselves as red Tories. That's not to say there aren't a lot of people who would consider voting Conservative who describe themselves as moderate. Who are sort of mainstream and not hard right ideologues. But I think a lot of those people voted for Pierre Poilievre. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people who stepped up and put his name first on their ballot. I don't think that many people are describing themselves as deep blue, hard right partisans. I think that's unlikely.
I think there's another category potentially between convoy conservatives and club conservatives, and that's conservative conservatives. I mean, people talk about, is there a place for the red Tories in this party? I want to know, is there a place for the blue Tories? Is there a place for people who actually believe in conservatism, in smaller government, lower taxes, limited government? Well, what's he actually talked about during this campaign? He's talked about the convoy, he's talked about vaccine mandates, he's talked about firing the Bank of Canada governor, he's talked about, a lot of things that don't really have a lot to do with substantive policy terms, but can get people really excited in the base because he's owning the libs, he's fighting it back.
You saw his victory speech.
Yeah.
He mentioned lower taxes in the victory speach.
Yeah.
Right? He mentioned less government in the victory speech.
He mentioned them. I'm just saying, what did he actually spell out about what he would do? I will give him credit for one thing. He has talked about he's going to appoint a commission, which we used to laugh at as being vague, but it's the most specific thing he said during the campaign is he's going to appoint a commission to come back and report on tax reform. Tax reform is desperately needed. I hope we'll hear more about that. But this was, as I say, this is not about. There's no such thing really as Poilievree-ism as an ideology. It's more a disposition. It's a stance. It's for people who feel like they've been talked down to and pushed around. And he comes around and he says, "I'm going to fight for you." Now that's part of politics.
No, I get
but
that.
You just wish there was a bit more there.
I get that, and he is clearly the champion of that group.
Yeah.
But again, Tasha Kierden was here last week, and I see it with my own eyes. There are people in this country who are moderate, pragmatic, middle of the road, what you might have called back in the day red Tories, but maybe they're not. Maybe a lot of them are blue Tories as well. I went through riding by riding after that convention was over. Yeah. There's 338 ridings in the country, and Poilievre won 330 of them. Yeah. Charest won 8. Yeah. Is there still I'm going to ask it again, is there a place for moderate, pragmatic conservatives in this party under his leadership?
Let's talk about the people, these people that he attracted, who I think many are talking about grievance politics and they're angry. They came, he would do these rallies and he would stay for hours after the fact, sometimes till 1 or 2 a.m., and he would talk to every single one of them that was interested, which were a lot of them. And the things they brought up were inflation. And they would say just inflation because, he's a strong politician, and so he branded inflation based on the guy who he thinks is the cause of it. And they would say, I think this guy's going to bring down inflation by shrinking the size of government. They would bring up free speech, and they would say they have a problem with some of the bills before Parliament or that have been passed by the Liberals that they think restrict free speech, which I know Andrew has a problem with some of those as well. So these are people talking about really specific policy commitments that Pierre Poilievre has made. And in many cases, they're saying, I voted Liberal in 2015, and I'm not interested anymore, or I voted NDP the last time around, or I voted when I was younger, and I've just given politics a break for a while because I think no one's spoken for me. These are not people who define themselves as on an ideological spectrum. They're defined by the fact they can't fill their car tank with gas. They think government's gotten too big, and they want government to leave them alone, and it's telling them what to do. And so you can say that, in some ways, I think Poilievre is punished for being a strong communicator because it means that therefore there must be no substance. Well, I think part of why he's a strong communicator is because he's talking to people about inflation and lower taxes and smaller government, and there's substance to it. There's policy behind it, but because he's a strong communicator, it's reported on as a message that is really compelling to people.
Pragmatism is the flip side of that is opportunism. And so I do actually think pragmatic Tories have a place in this party because what you're going to see, I think, from Pierre Poilievre is a lot of the same things you saw from Stephen Harper, a lot of the same people around him. So I think you'll see a lot of the same kind of micro-targeting of policies to particular demographics they're trying to reach. It will not have, I don't think, people who think that they're going to get a really strong, robust, small-c conservatism from Pierre Poilievre, I think may be disappointed. But I think what you're going to see is much more tactical. What you will see, certainly, though, is there's not going to be any division in the party in the sense of there's no real regional divide, except perhaps with some Quebec MPs, but he won all their ridings. And you're not
going to... got a pretty French-sounding last name, too.
That's right. And there's nobody there, there's nobody who's going to lead any kind of opposition to him within the party. So he's kind of nuked any potential. I think the greater danger is you're going to have a bunch of people sitting on their hands who aren't particularly enamored of his style of politics, who won't go out and be activists for him, and who won't vote for him. So there's certainly a lot of people who would be desperate to vote against the Liberals, who've been waiting for a Conservative Party that could deliver them from the Liberals.
And is he the option they're looking for?
Who will stay with the Liberals. And there'll be a certain proportion of Tories Tory voters who will either sit home or vote Liberal.
Well, here he was, Saturday night, 8 p.m., the winning speech. Sheldon, roll it if you would.
They don't need a government that sneers at them, looks down on them, calls them names. They don't need a government to run their lives. They need a government that can run a passport office. They need a prime minister who hears them and offers them hope that they can, again, afford to buy a home, a car, pay their bills, afford food, have a secure retirement, and God forbid, even achieve their dreams if they work hard. They need a prime minister who will restore that hope, and I will be that prime minister.
I got to hand it to him. He is a great speaker. And he is, the camera likes him. He knows how to perform. He's got the snappy statements. Apropos of Andrew's question, though, how much is behind all of that snappiness?
I think there's a lot. He made a lot of policy announcements throughout the campaign that ladder up to similar themes, reducing the size of cost in government, getting government out of your way, whether it's policing your speech or policing how many vaccines you have to have in order to keep your job. He talked about a pay-as-you-go act that for every new dollar spent in government, the government would have to reduce it. We talked about tax reform. There were all kinds of policy commitments he made. He talked about, we haven't even talked about gatekeepers yet. One of the other big themes is this idea that Canada can't do anything anymore or build anything anymore because there are all these ridiculous gatekeepers in the way. And if you're a young person who doesn't think of yourself as a liberal or a conservative, or maybe you're going to switch your vote because you're a switcher, according to a pollster, no, you just can't afford a house. And you're 35, and you don't understand why. And the more you read about it, the more you realize it's because houses aren't being built. There are nowhere near enough of them. So that's pretty policy laden, and it's pretty moderate.
Well, let me pick up on this because here's sorry to read the competition here, but here's Chris Selly from the National Post writing yesterday. Okay, Sheldon, let's go with this. The knocks against Poilievre are mostly not about his policies, but his applause lines. Fire the governor of the Bank of Canada. Down with the globalist conspirators of the WEF, and rightly so. What policy he does have, though, is old-time conservative religion. Smaller government, getting our natural resources to market, more individual freedom in our personal and professional lives, ending the Liberals' laughable efforts to censor the internet, defunding the CBC, and ending media bailouts. Fiscal restraint after a long period without much of it. Now, that sounds like a bit of a mission statement, don't you think?
The slogans are there, the buzzwords are there, the policy substance is not. So, Ginny listed some of the things he said, and that was more or less the sum total of what he said, and it wasn't that much. So yeah, you can say the most substantive thing was tax reform, and that was I'll appoint a commission. He said nothing about where he would cut spending. He has no actual coherent critique of the Bank of Canada. All he says is we shouldn't have this inflation that every other country has. He has not said, okay, what would you have done during the pandemic thing? Would you have not have helped people with the amount of spending the government did during the pandemic during the lockdown when everything was shut down? If you did have all that spending, would you simply have let interest rates rise, without the Bank of Canada buying up those bonds? He's not really addressed any of that, and he certainly hasn't said what he'd do different now. He just says, well, interest rates are going up and it's all because, this is not actual policy substance. It's just kind of mouthing buzzwords. Now, the speech was good in the sense that it focused on the economy. So at least he's focusing on the theme. And I think it's a much more coherent theme for him if you're going into a general election than to be talking about the World Economic Forum and vaccine mandates, which will be old news by the time the election rolls around. But it will depend in part on what happens with the economy. If the economy really goes in the tank, he probably won't have to deal a lot of substance because people will be so angry at the government they just want to throw them out anyway. And that may be his calculation. But it's fair for him to have that strategy, but it's fair for the rest of us to point it out.
After his victory, Ginny, everyone was talking unity, right? Which they usually do after conventions, if you're lucky. Here's what Marjorie Le Breton had to say back in June. She said, and this is a former conservative activist, worked with Brian Mulroney, senator, I really fear that the great accommodation that was reached between Stephen Harper and Peter MacKay in the fall of 2003 is fracturing beyond repair. What do you think?
That's what she said about Stephen Harper too, quite literally. And then she joined his government in a really prominent role. So, look, also I should say, as part of that great bargain, Peter MacKay and the PCs argued for a point system, which they got, and which vastly favored Pierre Poilievre in this race. So the very system that was meant to make sure that any leader had appeal across the country from out west to out east, in parts of the country that were the most populated, so that you wouldn't be able to just sell a bunch of memberships in Calgary, which is what everyone thought Pierre Poilievre would do. No, he dominated that point system, the symbol of exactly what she's talking about. And so, I think she may miss the era of club conservatives, but I think millions of Canadians just do not. And not only that, they don't even identify with it.
Well, follow up with this, because he wrote the other day that the government of the day is, I think the expression was, ripe for the plucking. That's a good one. The conventional wisdom has been that Jean Charest might have been a better leader for those who are, anxious to get rid of the Liberals, and he's a sort of a moderate Tory that they can wrap their arms around, whereas Poilievre scares the hell out of people who want to defect from the Liberals, and therefore his victory ensures that those people will go home to the Liberal Party. Can you speak to that?
I think that characterization is defined too often by conservatives who only talk to Liberals. And it's, there's this phenomenon of you think you should vote for every Liberal's favorite conservative. Well, those Liberals are going to keep voting Liberal, right? And often those people, I think, don't talk to the types of people who came out to Pierre Poilievre's rallies, many of whom were not partisans or even vote switchers who identify as liberal or conservative. They're just regular people, many of whom vote less frequently, or their vote jumps all over the place depending on what their concern is that week, because they're preoccupied not with where someone sits on the ideological spectrum, but with whether they can afford milk, whether they can afford to gas their car, and who is speaking to them on the issues that matter to them most. And so I think it's easy to get distracted by that strategy, and I just think it's built on something that doesn't really exist.
Do you think the party made a mistake picking him?
We shall see. They've made a bet, let's put it that way. I just want to address Marjorie's point just very briefly. This isn't that party that she was talking about. That party was 20 years ago. There's now 670,000 members as of election day, leadership election day, 500,000 of whom, came in the course of this campaign, right? They were new signups. So it's a very different party than it was in the past. They've made a bet that they don't need to go for the center voter. And this is an eternal debate in the Conservative Party. Do you win by winding up the base and getting them excited and winning on turnout? Or do you win by reaching across and trying to get centrist voters to come across? Do you win by expanding the base? They've run this experiment a couple of times. 2019 was a turn out the base vote and they didn't win. And then 2021, they tried to expand the base for the first half of the campaign and they were winning. And then it imploded on itself because of the internal contradictions.
In fairness, they got the most votes in both of those elections.
That's right. But the trouble is it's not well distributed. And what they've done with this choice and the types of approach that they're taking is they're going to do very, very well once again in Western Canada. They're going to win 80% majorities in Western Canada. Are they going to win the suburban Toronto vote? Are they going to win in Quebec? Are they going to win amongst women? That's, I think, remains to be seen. But the calculation is we can not only wind up the base, we can get those People's Party voters to come back to us, and we can turn out people who've never voted before, the kinds of people who signed up during the course of this leadership campaign. It's a big bet. It's a risky one. We'll see.
Yeah, let's talk about. I kind of reject the premise that every voter can be placed on a spectrum, from PPC on the far right to NDP on the far left, and that everyone's just you're picking and choosing voters from this place on the spectrum. And we should talk about these regions that matter, right? I mean, Windsor, Ontario, for instance, or Vancouver Island in BC. I mean, these are places where Pierre Poilievre did very well. He had incredible turnout at his rallies, in many cases from people who were unidentifiable on this spectrum. And we know that Doug Ford's a very good example in Ontario of a conservative who can win if they sort of reject the premise of that spectrum, because they speak to types of people who have types of concerns, workers, young people who can't afford housing, and who don't put themselves on that spectrum. And so will some of those people who be people who voted PPC last time? Yes, absolutely. I think many of them will be people who voted Liberal last time, too.
I agree with Ginny that most voters aren't that ideological, but they're also not purely based on policy and what it means to me either. They're also looking at the leader in a big way. And some voters get very excited by a leader who's very hot and very angry and turns up the temperature. A lot of voters are repelled by that. A lot of voters are moderates in the sense that what they're looking for is moderation of temperament. They're looking, do you have good judgment? Lining up with the convoy protesters, telling people to get into Bitcoin because it'll hedge against inflation. These do not bespeak mature judgment. And I think for that kind of moderate voter, he's got a hard sell ahead of him.
Does he lack judgment in as much as Conservatives, I always thought, stood for law and order, and he was pretty clearly with the convoy, which at the end of the day was not about much law and order.
I think he was with the convoy for the same reason that I think the one poll showed that a third of Canadians felt empathy for people who were protesting because they felt like the governments of all levels had just cracked down on freedom in a way that was totally unnecessary and hadn't looked at the harms caused by some of the COVID restrictions. And I think that was a risky move for him that paid off because it showed that he was willing not to take the safe option in a given moment, but to assess what was going on and assess through his own lens of what he thinks is important, freedom primarily. And he made a choice that I think people will remember in a positive way. As to his sort of judgment and temperament. This is a pretty thoughtful guy, and I think we should assess the way he's going to communicate with Canadians based on the speech that you played. I think that was a really strong example of where you're going to see his message and communications go.
Okay. We got a couple of minutes left here, and let's talk climate change here. I think it's fair to say that one of the reasons the Conservatives did not have a central Canadian breakthrough in the last two elections is because the biggest chunk of the electorate in Quebec and Ontario decided that the party had virtually nothing of importance to say about climate change. Does Pierre Poilievre have anything important to say about climate change that you think could ameliorate that situation for the party?
Not at the moment. He's talked vaguely about the way that many conservative politicians do of we're going to emphasize technology rather than taxes, which again is a slogan, not a policy. He certainly appeals to people who don't think that we need to do anything about climate change. And it certainly is in line with the conservative approach to date, for the most part, which has been we don't want to use pricing to reduce carbon emissions, even though that's absolutely the lowest cost, most efficient way of doing it. We want to use a lot of other things that are way more costly, but where the costs are hidden from people and therefore won't be as politically costly to us. He seems to be very much in that vein. What I will say is, if we're into a recession in the next couple of years, it may be that people won't be as concerned about climate change as they were in the past.
Has he had anything relevant to say about climate change during this campaign?
Well, I think he has, because I think what's relevant for most Canadians about climate change is that they take it seriously and they want a leader who takes it seriously, but they don't want, in the name of climate change, to be penalized to the point where it affects their ability to afford their everyday lives. And a consumer-facing price on carbon pretty definitively is not something he's going to support, and it's not something a lot of Canadians support if it means that they can also feel like that the government's doing something about climate change. So look, he's talked about getting our energy resources to market in a global marketplace where really heavy emitters who could care less about climate change as countries are supplying much of the world's power right now and energy at a time when it's scarce. Meanwhile, Canadian resources are sort of, in many cases, sitting in the ground because of decisions the government's made. So I think that it's a big conversation. There are global events that are happening, not just inflation, but insecurity and geopolitics that will factor into people's balance on climate change, taking it seriously, but also making smart choices for Canada. And I think he will find a message and a path that appeals to a lot of Canadians.
I think, for what it's worth, we have the two finest campaigners in the country leading the two biggest parties in the country right now, which sets up a titanic battle in the next election campaign. This should be one for the history books. Thank you, Andrew Coyne, Ginny Roth, for coming into TVO tonight.
Thanks, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.